For our Greek friends. Now, my topic will be the general background of the austerity politics, but with the emphasis on politics, because I think it's really important to see that this is not a matter of economic calculus. It's a matter of class power, which is being reasserted in the process. So austerity is a way of reimposing the full weight of the capitalist class, and the reason that that weight is such a painful experience is because capitalism is not working anymore. So to be pushed down by a system that's actually malfunctioning is more painful than if it would still have the potential to create welfare and prosperity for the people who are affected by it. Now, my first point will be that if we look at the post-war period as a whole, capitalism didn't exist as a fixed entity, but through a series of class compromises and very different forms of organizing society. And, well, it won't surprise you when I tell you that what we are now experiencing is the worst. And after that, I'll talk about what happened after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, which in itself was not so germane to what was going on within the capitalist system, except that after that time, not only did we see a radicalization of capitalist neoliberalism, but also a more military offensive posture. And I think all these things come together, and that's my last point, in the current conjuncture, which is not just one of austerity, but also the rise of neo-fascism and the spread of war, because one of the things that you can't have missed is that what we're seeing today is more and more war, and an ever more easy decision to go to war. To send planes is as normal today as to change a bus route in one of our big cities. So first, the idea of these class compromises, very briefly. After the war, in the so-called golden decades, which weren't so golden, I was there, and I remember it was very dull and regimented and so on and so forth, but every year things got better. Something I'm afraid most of you will not experience soon. At that time, society rested on a class compromise in production, mainly, between capital and organized labor. That was the backbone of everything that happened in society at the time. And that lasted broadly until the mid-70s, when it continued, that class compromise, but it continued on an inflationary basis. Because the monetary system, as you may recall, in 1971 went through a major mutation when the United States no longer was able to pay for the obligations that it had incurred, among other things, in the Vietnam War. And it had to cut the link between the dollar and gold. And from that moment on, there was an enormous explosion of the amount of dollars in circulation, which in itself led to a fueling of speculation, but I'll get to that later. So that first class compromise was officially abrogated, so it was ended, around 1979, because 1979 is really one of the crucial dates of the post-war period. And in 1979, what we got was, on the one hand, an attempt to impose the logic of pure money capital and profitability on the economy as it then functioned. And on the other hand, a turn to a new Cold War. You know, 79 is the year in which Margaret Thatcher was elected, in which, and she really symbolizes everything from her handbag to her hairdo to her statements. She symbolizes the era of neoliberalism then setting in. But it was also the year of the NATO missile decision, which put cruise missiles, a new weapon at the time, on locations where it reduced the warning time for the Soviet adversary in a military conflict to 3 minutes. And you can imagine what that did. Well, maybe we can't imagine, but I remember very well that it created a real panic in the Soviet Union, because they felt that this ended the arms race basically on terms of the opposite party. And 79, of course, most importantly, was the year in which Paul Volcker was appointed to head the American Federal Reserve, which is the central bank. And what he did, and there, of course, the people who know more about it will know that this was a protracted and half-hearted attempt. It wasn't a single step. But basically what he did, what his measures ended up in, was to raise the real interest rate. So the inflationary period that had set in 1971, in which every year, it's often forgotten, but every year, the world stock of US dollars increased with 10% from 1971 to 79. And that meant that countries could borrow very easily. And I still have an old copy at home of the, I think it's Fortune, you know, the business magazine of the United States in the US, where you see an advert of the Citibank, which has the Kremlin wall with all these with their bear skin hats and fur coats, standing for taking a parade. And the Citibank advertised with the solidity of this regime. You know, you can't imagine that today, but at that time it meant Citigroup lent out enormous sums of money to the Soviet Union to modernize its industry, and it advertised itself as the bank that was associated with this solid block of old guys who had things very firmly in their hands. Now that ended in 1979, because all the countries that had borrowed, and the ones that borrowed most were Yugoslavia, Poland. You know, Poland had the famous slogan at the time that they would become the Korea of Europe, and so on and so forth. From one day to the next, or almost the next, these countries were kicked into a debt crisis. The debt crisis of Yugoslavia, which also became a political crisis, the crisis of Poland, basically announcing the end of communism and so on and so forth, and of course Mexico, Brazil, and all these countries, they all slipped into a debt crisis because suddenly the debts that they had incurred were turned from inflationary dollars into hard dollars, and these dollars had to be earned by export offensives. Now, the class compromise that had existed in the post-war period between capital and organized labor, and this was, of course, confined to the developed countries because in the former colonial world, different things were happening, was replaced in the 1980s, so after that decision by Volcker to basically take inflation out of the system, was replaced by a class compromise between capital, but now predominantly not productive, but financial capital, and asset-owning middle classes. And these are people who have their own homes, can take a mortgage on it, etc., and can hope that the value of the underlying asset appreciates. So their homes becomes worth more, and that means that the mortgage becomes less of a burden. And that class compromise lasted until, well, in some cases, in mine for instance, until the present, but in many other cases it ended in the course of the 90s. And then we slipped into a third form of capitalism, which was no longer merely financial in the sense of restoring profitability, which had been Volcker's aim, and Margaret Thatcher's aim, and her advisors and so on, and Ronald Reagan's. But now we slipped into a form of capitalism which was entirely speculative. So it was about money, but not money to be invested in real ventures that would bring a profit, but money that was used to speculate on currency markets, to actually take these mortgages not as something that would one day be repaid, but that you could repackage into debt, so-called debt instruments and derivatives, that you could insure yourself against, that if somebody would not pay their debt at some point, their mortgage debt for instance, that you could nevertheless cash in on account of a so-called credit default swap, which is a derivative, so an obligation that somebody takes on to pay you back when the person who's supposed to pay you back actually doesn't show up. Now, in that case, in the case that we've had from, here it's more difficult to say which date we should pick because it's not so clear as in 79, but I would say that from the early 90s we get into that stage of what I would call predatory neoliberalism. So you really have predators who prey on society and who are not looking for solid investments, but who are looking to create bubbles in which they put their money into fast rising values, which can be Argentine debt, mortgages, oil stocks, anything that promises to bring rapidly rising income, and who then are the first to deflate that bubble. So they go into East Asia, for instance. I mentioned the most spectacular case in 1998, and they pull out the first. These currencies then collapse, but since these banks and hedge funds and other operators were the first to actually precipitate that whole process, they also come out best. So they earn in the bubble phase when it's blowing up, and they earn money in the phase when it deflates. At the same time, there's nobody in society anymore, except from some pockets of labor which still are in that old class compromise in production, or some asset-owning middle classes which are still in that other class compromise, but otherwise there's nobody anymore in the large mass of the population who profits from this. And that leads you to something which is characteristic of our epoch and must be understood, a sort of compensatory ideological campaign for nationalism, for xenophobia, and ultimately a readiness to engage in wars. And I think that's really important. Here in Holland, for the Dutch people and maybe for the Greeks who follow Dutch politics as well, you saw very recently the interesting phenomenon that Frans Timmermans, our foreign secretary, who has suddenly been elevated to the status of a statesman because he gave a talk in the United Nations in reasonably well English. He got a job in the European Commission. We didn't know yet which job, but all the newspapers were cheering that we got an important job. Nobody asked, is this man actually being elected for this post? Is this a triumph for democracy or whatever? No, our man was being considered for a top job. That was enough, and there was already irritation that some other people might, spoil the game and so on and so forth.